It's got my emergency kit. I know I dropped that orange nylon pouch 3 miles back, near the limestone shelf. But it's sitting right here on the shelter floor. I didn't put it there. I haven't moved from this bunk in, God, I don't even know how long. Hours. My headlamp's dying, and I keep telling myself I'm counting wrong, that I miscounted the miles, that I dropped it closer than I remember. But I know these trails. I've walked this ridge 11 Octobers running. I don't misplace things. The mountain does that for me now. There. Hear that? That's my boot. That's the drag. My left boot's got a worn heel. Always has. Since the Smokies in 19. And it drags just like that on wood. Like that. Right there. Someone's climbing the steps, and they're doing my walk. They're doing it exactly. Well now, settle in. My name's Abe Vance, and this here's a case file out of the Redacted Archives. Pulled it myself off a reel of micro-cassette some search and rescue boys found wedged under a rock shelf. Batteries long dead, tape half chewed by mice. Took me the better part of a winter to get it playable. Before I tell you what happened to the young man on that tape, his name was Nolan, and he was, by every account, a careful hiker, a smart one, the kind who never left so much as a granola wrapper behind on a trail. I got to tell you about a rule. Not a posted rule, not one you find laminated at a trailhead kiosk between the bear safety pamphlet and the fire danger index. This is older than the Forest Service, older than the maps, older than the surveyors who first walked these gaps with their chains and their compasses and never did manage to get the contour lines quite right. The old-timers up in these gaps used to say it different ways, but it always came down to the same warning, passed low and quiet around a wood stove, the way you'd pass along something you half believed and was still too careful to test. Leave no trace. That phrase you hear from every ranger and every guidebook. Up here, it cuts both directions. The mountain keeps a ledger. Every sock you lose, every wrapper the wind takes, every knife that slips through a torn pocket seam, it's tallied, written down somewhere in the limestone and the leaf rot, in ledgers older than any of us. Most times it don't mean nothing. The woods just hold on to things, swallow them down into the duff and the moss. But every so often, and I want you to listen close here because this is the part that matters. Every so often, you'll be walking a trail you've walked 100 times, and there, sitting just ahead of you, placed neat as a place setting on a mossy stone, or laid soft over a low branch, will be the very thing you lost. Miles back, hours back, sitting there like it walked itself into position. Don't touch it. Because if the mountain is showing you what you dropped, it means it's got enough now. Enough pieces. And it's assembling something. It's finishing a puzzle. And I promise you, you do not want to see the picture on the box. That's the rule the old-timers gave me. And that's the rule Nolan didn't know. So let's go on and tell his story from the start. Nolan was 34 years old, and he'd been section hiking the high gaps of the ridge for the better part of a decade. A careful man, methodical, the kind who double-checked his knots and packed his first aid kit in the same left-side pouch every single trip, out of habit, out of comfort. He knew these mountains the way another man might know the furniture in his own dark house, by feel, by memory, without needing to look. That October, the freeze came in early and mean. The kind of cold that isn't dramatic, isn't a storm you can point to, just a slow, biting damp that gets down into the joints and doesn't leave. He'd started the ridge traverse at first light, a stretch of unmapped high trail the locals called the High Gaps, where the contour lines on any topo map go soft and uncertain, like the cartographers themselves had lost confidence. By early afternoon, the fog rolled in. Not weather exactly, more like the mountain exhaling. A milk-white fog that didn't drift so much as settle, low and thick between the hemlock trunks, swallowing the tops of the ridgeline until the whole world narrowed down to maybe 30 feet of visibility in any direction. The temperature dropped with it, degree by degree, until his breath hung in front of him in slow gray ribbons. And it was quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Wrong quiet. No birds. Not a single call. Not a rustle of something small moving through the leaf litter. Just his own boots on the trail. And underneath that, a silence so complete it felt like pressure against his eardrums, like being underwater. The hemlocks themselves seemed to lean in closer than they should have, their lower branches heavy and black with damp, brushing his shoulders on a trail that had been, by his memory, twice this wide. Moss climbed the trunks in thick, wet pelts, soft as fur under his glove when he steadied himself against one. Where the fog thinned for just a moment near a low clearing, he could see his own breath hanging motionless in the air behind him, as if even the wind had gone still to listen to him pass. He told himself it was just the cold, just the season. Birds go quiet before a freeze, that's all. That's natural, He kept narrating it to himself, the way you do when the woods start feeling less like woods and more like something holding its breath around you. The damp got into everything, into his gloves, into the collar of his jacket, into the space behind his knees. It wasn't the kind of cold you could out-hike. It just accumulated, patient, settling into the marrow the way water settles into a low place in the ground. Somewhere past the third switchback, reaching back for his trail mix, his hand found a tear in the side pocket of his pack, a long diagonal rip he hadn't noticed, hadn't heard, hadn't felt happen. And with it, gone, his knife. Good one, custom handle, a gift from his father, carried on every trip he'd taken since he was 19 years old. He stopped in the fog, and he felt for it the way you feel for a missing tooth with your tongue, disbelieving, prodding at the empty space like it might resolve itself, like his fingers had simply missed it. They hadn't. Now here is where I want you to understand something about a man like Nolan. He was not reckless. He was not foolish. But a knife, out here, in that cold, on unmapped ground, it isn't sentiment. It's survival. Kindling, cordage, a blade between you and the parts of these mountains that don't care for people much at all. So as the light started dying behind that wall of fog, as the gray afternoon bled down toward a blacker gray, Nolan made the one mistake every ranger, every guidebook, every old-timer on this ridge will tell you never, ever to make. He turned around. He went back the way he came, after dusk, off the safety of forward progress, back into ground he'd already covered, violating without knowing it the oldest unspoken perimeter these mountains keep. You go forward after dark. You never, ever go back. But he didn't know that rule yet. Nobody had told him. So he walked back into the fog, headlamp cutting a small cone of gray-white light, hunting the ground for a glint of steel that wasn't there. The fog thickened past anything Nolan had ever walked through, a true whiteout, his headlamp beam just bouncing back at him off a wall of pale nothing, swallowing even the trail markers nailed into the trunks at eye level. He walked slower, and slower still, until his own pace felt like wading through something thicker than air. He crouched at the spot he thought he remembered, hands sweeping through wet leaves, through cold mud, fingertips going numb inside sodden gloves, finding nothing but the mountain's own cold indifference. He tried the next spot, and the next. The beam of his headlamp swallowed whole after only a few feet, the fog pressing so close now that it seemed to breathe against his face in slow, damp pulses. Somewhere behind him, or beside him, or both at once, the fog made distance meaningless. He thought he heard a single soft click, like a buckle tapping against stone. And he told himself it was only his own pack shifting on his back. He gave it up somewhere past an hour, told himself the knife was gone, that it was just a thing, replaceable, that the smarter move now, the only move now, was to get himself back to the nearest backcountry shelter before the last of the light burned out of the sky entirely. So he turned again, started back along the switchbacks, boots finding the trail more by memory than by sight. And that's when he saw it, sitting upright on a mossy log just ahead of him, blade folded shut, standing on its spine like it had been placed there, deliberate, centered, waiting. His knife. He didn't move for a long moment. Just stood there in the fog with his headlamp trembling slightly across that small, dark shape. Some part of him already understanding, in a place below language, that this was wrong before his conscious mind had caught up to why. He picked it up anyway. He didn't know the rule yet. Nobody does the first time. And when he turned it over in his gloved hand, his breath went shallow. The metal, bright oiled steel just hours before, was pitted now, corroded in patches like decades of rust had happened in an afternoon. Packed into the hinge and the handle grooves was a fine gray dust. And when he lifted it close, the smell hit him. Wet limestone. And beneath that, something colder. The smell of deep earth, of caves, of ground that never sees sun. He told himself it was just the fog playing tricks with the smell. Told himself the cold had done something to the steel he didn't understand. He put it in his pocket and he kept walking, faster now, because some old animal part of him had started counting his own footsteps and did not like the number it was arriving at. Not 20 minutes on, pressed flat against the bark of a black birch at exactly eye level, he found the foil wrapper from a protein bar he'd eaten that morning, the one he distinctly remembered folding and stuffing deep in a zippered pocket. It was brittle now, sun-faded, though there'd been no sun, furred at the edges with a dry gray mold that looked, in his headlamp beam, like something that had been growing undisturbed for 20 years. He didn't stop to touch that one. He walked past it, faster, breath fogging harder in front of him. Then his wool socks, the spare pair still in the pack this morning, he'd checked, he'd swear to it, draped neat over a low branch like laundry hung out to dry, gray with age, riddled with moth holes that should have taken a decade to form. He didn't stop for those either. It was around then that Nolan noticed the trail didn't feel right underfoot. The distances had gone strange, compressed, folding in on themselves, like landmarks he remembered being 20 minutes apart were arriving in 5. Like the mountain had stopped measuring things the way mountains are supposed to. And in the laurel thickets running parallel to the trail, close enough to touch if he'd reached out into that fog, he began to hear it. Footsteps, matching his own pace, step for step, almost, not quite in sync, a half beat behind, like an echo arriving late, like a second recording layered under the first and playing a fraction of a second slow. And in that near echo, underneath the ordinary footfalls, a drag, a specific, worn heel drag, his drag, the exact sound his own left boot made, walking beside him in the dark, through brush too thick for a man to move through that quietly, that fast. He did not stop walking. He did not look toward the thicket. He kept his eyes forward, and he kept moving. And somewhere in that long, fog-choked mile, Nolan stopped believing this was a trick of sound or cold or exhaustion, and started understanding with a dread that settled into him slower and colder than the temperature ever had, that something out there in the white was walking a rehearsal of him. He reached the shelter a little after midnight. 3 sides of gray, weathered lumber, a shingled roof gone soft and black with rot, 2 sleeping platforms facing each other across 4 feet of dirt floor. The temperature had fallen hard, into the kind of cold that makes the air itself feel brittle. He swept his headlamp across the floor before he'd even set down his pack, and that's when he saw the boot prints, fresh, mud-dark, still glistening faintly in the light. They came in from the absolute blackness beyond the tree line, crossed the dirt apron in front of the shelter, climbed the 3 wooden steps, and ended, not at his platform, but at the empty one across from it, the bunk directly opposite his own. He crouched over them a long moment, headlamp shaking slightly in his grip, and made himself look close. The tread matched his own boots. Not similar, matched, down to the worn diagonal wear pattern on the left heel, the exact gait length of a man his height and his stride, the exact weight distribution of a man carrying his exact pack. He understood, standing there, that the mountain hadn't just been tracking him through the fog. It had been collecting him, piece by piece, item by item, the knife, the wrapper, the socks, each one aged, altered, return changed, and each return had been another measurement taken, another piece fitted into a shape assembling itself somewhere out past the tree line. And now that shape had walked itself up the steps and lay down in the empty bunk across from his. Nolan did not check the far platform with his light. Some decisions he'd tell you later, if he'd ever told anyone at all. Some decisions get made by the oldest part of you, the part that doesn't need convincing. He crawled into his own sleeping bag instead, boots still on, and he lay there rigid, staring at the low black ceiling of the lean-to, listening. For a while there was only the wind and his own heartbeat, too loud in his ears. Then, from the dark beyond the open front of the shelter, slow, patient, in absolutely no hurry at all, came the sound of a boot finding the first wooden step. A pause, then the drag, that worn heel drag, dragging itself up onto the second step, into the shelter, toward the platform across from his, where something was already, impossibly, lying down. And that, dear listener, is where the tape runs out. Now, I won't tell you whether they ever found him. Some case files close that way, quiet, unfinished. the way these mountains prefer their endings. What I will tell you is the rule, one more time, plain, before you drift off tonight. Check your pack before you leave the trailhead. Count your gear twice. And if you should ever be walking out there in your own high gaps, and you come across something you lost, miles back, hours back, sitting neat and waiting just ahead of you on the path, you let the mountain keep it. You never, ever turn back for what it's already taken. Sleep well now.